A few weeks later, it ends up sitting on a shelf. Months pass. Then you buy something else for seed starting, something else for pests, something else for cleaning tools. Meanwhile, the bottle you already owned never leaves the shelf. The problem isn't that gardeners don't own hydrogen peroxide. It's that they think it's a single-purpose product. And that misunderstanding quietly costs them money, time, and opportunities to solve problems before they get worse. In this video, we're going through 7 hidden garden uses that most people never connect to hydrogen peroxide. Some help before problems start. Some help when plants are already struggling. And one completely changes how you think about the value of that bottle in the first place. We'll start with a use that most gardeners overlook at the very beginning of the growing season. Because if you're only reaching for hydrogen peroxide after something goes wrong, you may be missing one of the easiest opportunities it offers. 1. Starting seeds. With hydrogen peroxide, you plant a tray with 72 cells. A week later, half the tray is growing. The other half looks exactly the same as the day you planted it. Same soil, same water, same temperature, yet some seeds thrive while others never really get going. That's the first surprise. Most gardeners think hydrogen peroxide belongs at the end of a problem. This use puts it at the very beginning. One overlooked use is during seed preparation. Some gardeners soak certain seeds in a diluted hydrogen peroxide solution before planting, because it may help clean the seed surface and create a more favorable starting environment. That matters because the beginning of the growing season sets the tone for everything that follows. A weak start can mean uneven germination, slower growth, and more frustration before plants ever reach the garden. The reason gardeners experiment with this approach comes down to 2 things. First, hydrogen peroxide is often used as a cleaning agent. Second, when it breaks down, it releases oxygen. Those 2 characteristics are why it continues showing up in conversations about seed starting. Now, this isn't a magic shortcut. Good seed quality still matters, proper moisture still matters, temperature still matters. Hydrogen peroxide cannot compensate for poor growing conditions, but it can be one more tool in the process. And that's the first mental shift in this video. Hydrogen peroxide isn't only for rescue situations. In some cases, it can be part of prevention. Once you start looking at it that way, a much bigger question appears. What happens when the problem has already started? Because one of the most common gardening mistakes creates exactly the kind of situation where hydrogen peroxide gets a lot more attention. 2. Recovering overwatered roots. You spend 6 weeks growing a healthy tomato plant in a container. Then 1 week of heavy watering changes everything. The leaves droop. Growth slows. The soil never seems to dry. Your first instinct is usually the same as everyone else's. The plant must need something. Sometimes the opposite is true. Overwatering can create conditions where roots struggle because they aren't getting enough oxygen. The soil may be holding plenty of moisture, but the root zone isn't functioning the way it should. This is one reason hydrogen peroxide became popular among growers dealing with overly wet conditions. Instead of looking only at the water, they start thinking about oxygen. That's a completely different way of viewing the problem. The visible symptom is drooping foliage. The hidden issue may be happening below the soil surface. When hydrogen peroxide breaks down, it releases oxygen. That's why some gardeners use it when trying to address mild overwatering situations. This use is different. Now we're responding to a problem that's already visible. That's a much bigger opportunity because plant replacement costs time, effort, and sometimes an entire growing season. Of course, there's an important limitation. Hydrogen peroxide is not a cure for severe root rot. If roots are badly damaged, no bottle is going to reverse months of decline. Here's what makes this valuable. Many gardeners spend days trying fertilizer, supplements, or new watering schedules before they realize they're solving the wrong problem. The practical takeaway is simple. When a plant shows signs of stress, don't automatically focus on what you're adding. Sometimes the better question is whether the roots can function properly in the conditions they're already in. And once you start paying attention to what happens below the soil surface, another hidden use starts to make a lot more sense. Because some garden pests spend part of their lives exactly where most people never look. 3. Breaking fungus. Gnat cycles. If you've ever watered a container and noticed tiny dark insects floating up around the soil, you've probably met fungus gnats. You've already put out sticky traps. Maybe more than once. The flying adults disappear. A week later, they're back again. The problem is that the adults aren't really the reason the infestation keeps returning. The real battle is happening in the soil, and that's the part most gardeners never see, which is exactly why the problem keeps coming back. This is where hydrogen peroxide enters the conversation again. Not because gardeners are trying to chase flying insects around the house, because they're trying to interrupt the stage that allows the population to continue. The visible pest isn't always the important pest. Many recurring garden problems survive because the source remains untouched. When growers talk about using hydrogen peroxide for fungus gnat management, the discussion usually centers on what is happening beneath the surface rather than what is flying around above it. That changes the entire strategy. Instead of treating symptoms over and over, the goal becomes disrupting the cycle. And that's a much more valuable lesson than simply getting rid of a few insects. The consequence of ignoring the source is repetition. The same problem keeps showing up. The same frustration keeps returning. The same solutions keep getting purchased. Hydrogen peroxide becomes interesting here because it is being used as part of a control strategy rather than a rescue strategy. There's an important limitation, though. A single treatment rarely solves every pest issue by itself. Environmental conditions, moisture levels, and overall plant health still matter. But this use introduces another mental model update. Hydrogen peroxide isn't only helping individual plants. It may also be useful when you're trying to interrupt conditions that allow problems to repeat. And once a product starts showing up in seed trays, root zones, and pest management, it becomes harder to view it as a single-purpose item. That's where the next discovery takes us. 4. Sanitizing garden tools. You prune a tomato plant, then a pepper plant, then a cucumber vine. Nothing looks wrong. That's exactly why most gardeners never think about the pruners in their hand. Most gardeners pay attention to soil, watering, and fertilizer. Far fewer think about what may be traveling from one plant to another on the tools themselves. This is another place where hydrogen peroxide becomes useful. Not because something is visibly wrong, because you're trying to keep a problem from moving. Earlier, hydrogen peroxide helped improve starting conditions. Then it appeared in root recovery and pest management. Here, it shows up in prevention. The strange thing about prevention is that you never get proof it worked. You only notice the problems that happen, not the ones that never had a chance to start. When tools move between plants, they can also move unwanted material from one location to another. That's why many gardeners make tool cleaning part of their routine instead of waiting for obvious trouble. Hydrogen peroxide is often used because it is already available and easy to incorporate into a maintenance habit. Tool sanitation doesn't eliminate every risk in a garden. Environmental conditions, weather, and plant stress still matter, but it can reduce one avoidable pathway, and that's where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The same bottle has now appeared during seed starting, plant recovery, pest management, and prevention. Those aren't variations of the same job. They're completely different categories. Midpoint reset. By now, you've probably noticed something strange. None of these uses solve the same problem, yet the same bottle keeps showing up. At this point, it's worth stopping for a second, because if these were just random gardening tricks, the pattern would have broken by now. Instead, hydrogen peroxide keeps appearing in situations that seem unrelated. A seed tray, an overwatered container, a fungus gnat problem, a pair of pruning shears. Those aren't the same problem. Most people evaluate garden products one use at a time. They ask, what is this for? A better question might be, how many different problems can this help me manage? That doesn't make hydrogen peroxide a cure-all, far from it. Every use we've discussed has limitations, but it does suggest that many gardeners are underestimating its utility. And the next two uses raise the stakes because they involve something every grower wants to avoid: losing healthy plants and losing harvests. 5. Reducing disease pressure before it spreads. Every gardener knows this feeling. You notice one strange spot on a leaf, then you spend the next several days wondering whether you're about to lose the entire plant. The challenge is that by the time major symptoms appear, the problem may already be established. That's why some gardeners think less about treatment and more about pressure. Disease pressure. The conditions that allow problems to gain momentum. Hydrogen peroxide sometimes enters the discussion at this stage because people are trying to address issues early rather than waiting for escalation. And that creates a valuable mental shift. Many gardeners treat disease management as a response. Experienced growers often treat it as timing. A single spot doesn't look expensive. Replacing the plant later might be. A minor issue today can become plant loss, reduced production, or weeks of frustration later in the season. That's why early action tends to receive more attention than dramatic rescue attempts. Hydrogen peroxide is not a guaranteed solution. It is not appropriate for every disease problem, and it cannot replace proper environmental management. Good airflow still matters. Plant spacing still matters. Watering practices still matter. But its value here comes from encouraging a different decision. Don't judge a problem only by how serious it looks right now. Judge it by what it might become. That change in risk evaluation is far more important than any individual application, because protecting plants is only part of the equation. Eventually, every gardener reaches the stage where the crop is finally ready to harvest, and surprisingly, that's where another hidden opportunity appears. 6. Harvest washing and shelf life extension. You finally harvest the tomatoes, or the peppers, or the cucumbers. The hard part feels finished. Then, 3 days later, some of that harvest is already getting soft on the counter. A beautiful harvest can deteriorate faster than expected. And that's frustrating because the growing season is already over. At that point, you're not losing effort. You're losing the reward for that effort. Moisture, handling, surface contamination, storage conditions. Several factors continue affecting produce after picking. This is why some gardeners include hydrogen peroxide in parts of their harvest handling process. Not because they're trying to grow better vegetables, because they're trying to protect the value they've already created. Earlier uses focused on seeds, roots, pests, and plant health. Now the focus shifts to the harvest itself. The crop is already successful. The question becomes, how long can that success last? The limitation matters here as well. Hydrogen peroxide is not a substitute for proper food handling practices or proper storage conditions. Those remain essential. But the larger lesson is difficult to ignore. The garden doesn't stop at harvest. Value can still be gained or lost after the growing season's hard work is finished. And once you recognize that, another question naturally follows. If one bottle keeps appearing across nearly every stage of gardening, How should you evaluate its value in the first place? Before we get to the final use, there's an important caution. The danger is that people discover a useful tool and immediately start using it for everything. That's usually where good gardening advice turns into bad gardening advice. That's not what this video is saying. Hydrogen peroxide has limitations. Every use we've discussed exists within a specific context. Good soil practices still matter. Proper watering still matters. Healthy growing conditions still matter. The reason these hidden uses are valuable isn't because hydrogen peroxide replaces gardening fundamentals. It's because it can complement them. That distinction matters. Otherwise, versatility starts to look like a miracle claim, and that's exactly where practical gardening advice loses credibility. The real opportunity isn't using hydrogen peroxide everywhere. It's recognizing when it creates value. And that leads directly to the most important use in this entire video. 7. Using hydrogen peroxide as a product replacement tool. The final hidden use isn't tied to a specific plant problem. It's tied to a purchasing decision. And in many ways, it's the discovery that makes all the others more meaningful. Most gardeners don't overspend because they buy bad products. They overspend because every new problem looks like a reason to buy another product. Think about everything we've already covered. Seed preparation, root zone recovery, pest cycle disruption, tool sanitation, disease pressure reduction, harvest protection. Most gardeners naturally place those tasks into separate categories. Different problems, different shelves, different products, different purchases. But hydrogen peroxide quietly crosses category boundaries. The biggest benefit may not be what it does in any one situation. The biggest benefit may be how often it remains relevant across completely different situations. In other words, it keeps showing up in situations where other products only solve one problem. And that kind of versatility has value. When a product can participate in multiple stages of gardening, it becomes easier to justify keeping it available. More importantly, it changes how you evaluate future purchases. Instead of asking, "What does this product do?" you begin asking, "How many jobs does this product help me accomplish?" That's a far more powerful question. Hydrogen peroxide isn't the answer to every challenge in the garden. But it is a useful example of what high-utility tools look like. And once you recognize that pattern, it becomes difficult to stop seeing it elsewhere. So how should you actually think about hydrogen peroxide after everything we've covered? Probably not as a treatment, not as a rescue product, not as a gardening miracle. Think of it as a utility tool, a resource that may provide value in multiple situations when used appropriately. That's an important distinction because it changes the decision entirely. The wrong question is, should I use hydrogen peroxide for everything? The right question is this one of the highest utility tools available to me? For many gardeners, that's where hidden spending starts to disappear. Not through one dramatic result, through repeated usefulness. A small improvement during seed starting, a helpful option when dealing with wet soil, a role in pest management, a role in maintenance, a role in harvest protection. None of those alone create the entire value proposition. Together, they do. That's why strategic use matters more than frequent use. The goal isn't to reach for hydrogen peroxide constantly. The goal is to recognize situations where it can legitimately create value. And that's a very different way of thinking about garden supplies. At the beginning of this video, hydrogen peroxide probably looked like a simple product with one familiar purpose. Now the picture is much larger. What started as a bottle associated with a single task turned out to appear at multiple stages of the gardening process, before planting, during growth, during problem management, during maintenance, even after harvest. The pattern isn't that hydrogen peroxide is extraordinary, the pattern is that versatility itself has value. And that's the final recalculation. The bottle wasn't the thing being wasted. The wasted part was all the problems it could have helped solve while it sat unused on the shelf. Once you begin evaluating garden tools by the number of useful jobs they can perform instead of the single job they're known for, your decisions start to change. Not just with hydrogen peroxide, with every product you bring into your garden. And that's the hidden opportunity most people miss.